What if I told you that the most expensive dress in the room became worthless in less than 3 seconds? That a charity gala meant to celebrate family values would expose the ugliest truth about marriage? And that sometimes your water breaking in front of 300 people is exactly the wake-up call you didn't know you needed tonight. We're diving into Victoria's story, a woman who thought she had the perfect life, wealthy husband, beautiful home, baby on the way. But perfection, as Victoria was about to discover, can be the most dangerous illusion of all. Picture this. You're 8 months pregnant, wearing a custom gown that costs more than most people's cars, standing beside your husband as he gives a speech about family values. The cameras are flashing, the crowd is applauding, and then, rip, your dress tears, your water breaks. And in that moment of complete vulnerability, you realize that the man holding your arm isn't trying to protect you, he's the one who caused your fall. But here's what makes Victoria's story extraordinary. She didn't just survive that night, she transformed it into the foundation for something her husband and his mistress never saw coming. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and prepare for a story about golden cages, hidden truths, and the moment one woman discovered that the key to her freedom had been in her hands all along. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. The sound of crystal champagne glasses clinking echoed through the marble-clad bedroom. Victoria Hammond stood before her full-length mirror, adjusting the custom navy silk gown that barely accommodated her 8-month pregnant belly. The Hermes dress cost more than most people's cars. She knew this because her husband told her. Twice. "Remember, we're announcing the new wing tonight," Rich said as he fastened the diamond necklace around her throat. His fingers lingered just a moment too long. Not affection, control. "Smile. Look grateful. Don't embarrass me." Victoria caught her reflection in the mirror. Pale, tired, but still beautiful. Still useful for appearances. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing the tension that filled every corner of their pristine home. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. Rich entered from his walk-in closet, adjusting his black bow tie with practiced precision. At 45, he still cut an impressive figure, old money charm mixed with new money ambition. The kind of man who commanded rooms simply by walking into them. "The Peterson deal closes next week," he said, not really speaking to her, but at her. "This gala is crucial for maintaining relationships. I need you focused tonight." Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly. The baby had been restless all day, rolling and kicking as if trying to escape the confines of her womb. She understood the feeling. "I understand," she said. Rich's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Victoria caught the briefest smile cross his lips before his expression returned to neutral. He typed a quick response, his thumbs moving with the familiarity of frequent communication. "Ready?" he asked, pocketing the phone. Victoria reached for her evening bag, checking its contents one final time. Phone, lipstick, breath mints, the speech cards Rich had prepared for her in case anyone asked about the charity. She checked her phone. Lock, unlock, lock. The same nervous habit she'd developed over the past few months, ever since finding the tube of coral lipstick in his car, a shade she'd never worn. The drive to the Four Seasons passed in relative silence. Rich fielded phone calls about real estate markets and zoning permits, while Victoria stared out at the city lights, one hand resting on her swollen abdomen. The baby's movements had grown more pronounced lately, stronger and more demanding. Sometimes she wondered if her unborn daughter could sense the undercurrents of tension that seemed to permeate every interaction between her parents. "The Winterfield Children's Hospital Gala," Rich said as they pulled into the circular drive, finally addressing her directly. "Remember, this is about establishing the Hammond family legacy. Our donation will fund the new pediatric wing. Your job is to look radiant and grateful." Victoria nodded, though something cold settled in her stomach. Our donation. She'd never seen the paperwork, never been consulted about the amount. In 6 years of marriage, she'd learned that our often meant his when it came to financial decisions. The valet opened her door, offering a white-gloved hand to help her navigate the exit gracefully despite her advanced pregnancy. The November air carried the scent of expensive perfumes and the sound of laughter from the hotel's entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the glittering crowd already assembled in the ballroom. "Show time," Rich murmured, offering his arm. As they walked through the lobby, Victoria's reflection caught in the polished marble walls. The navy gown complemented her blonde hair, pulled back in an elegant chignon. The diamonds at her throat caught the light. She looked every inch the successful businessman's wife, the perfect accessory to Rich's carefully cultivated image. But as they approached the ballroom doors, Victoria noticed a familiar figure near the registration table. Elena Cartwright stood talking animatedly with the event coordinator, her red hair catching the chandelier light like flame. Elena had been helping with Rich's business expansion for the past 18 months, specializing in international markets and offshore investments. Something about Elena's presence tonight made Victoria's stomach clench. The way she moved through the space with casual confidence, as if she belonged here, as if this were her event, her crowd, her world. "Elena's here," Victoria observed. "Business never stops," Rich replied, but his tone carried a note Victoria couldn't quite identify. Anticipation, perhaps, or satisfaction. Elena turned as they approached, her smile bright and professional. She wore a black cocktail dress that hugged her 28-year-old figure perfectly, her makeup flawless despite the long day. "Richard, Victoria," she said, air-kissing them both. "You look absolutely radiant tonight. Victoria, pregnancy suits you." The compliment felt hollow, delivered with the kind of practiced charm that came from years in business. Elena's eyes lingered on Rich just a moment longer than necessary, and Victoria felt a familiar twist of unease. "Thank you," Victoria replied. "I didn't realize you'd be attending tonight." "Last-minute addition," Elena said, glancing at Rich. "There are always opportunities to network at these events. Speaking of which, Richard, the Cavendish Group representatives are here. Perfect timing for our discussion about the Cayman expansion." Rich's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Victoria's arm. "We'll catch up later. Elena, tonight is about the hospital." But Victoria caught the look that passed between them, brief, loaded with meaning she couldn't decipher. Elena's smile widened slightly, as if she'd received some unspoken confirmation. "Of course," Elena said. "Enjoy your evening." As they moved into the ballroom proper, Victoria tried to shake off the feeling that she'd just witnessed something significant. The space was magnificent, draped in gold and white with towering floral arrangements that filled the air with the scent of roses and lilies. Round tables covered in crisp linens surrounded a small stage where a string quartet played softly. The Hammonds. Margaret Hammond's voice cut through the ambient conversation like a blade. Rich's mother appeared before them, resplendent in Chanel, and barely concealed disapproval. At 68, Margaret still commanded attention wherever she went, her steel-gray hair perfectly coiffed and her jewelry worth more than most people's homes. "Mother," Rich said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Margaret's sharp blue eyes assessed Victoria critically. "You look substantial tonight, dear. Though perhaps that dress is a bit snug around the middle." Victoria forced a smile. "Thank you, Margaret. You look lovely as always." The older woman's gaze flicked to Victoria's belly, then back to her face. "I do hope you're not planning to make a scene tonight. These people don't need to be reminded of the more biological aspects of motherhood." The words hit like small, precise cuts. Victoria had learned over the years that Margaret's cruelty was always delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. "I'll do my best to contain myself," Victoria replied, keeping her voice level. Rich seemed oblivious to the exchange, already scanning the room for important faces and crucial conversations. This was his element, this world of money and influence and carefully orchestrated relationships. Victoria had once found his ambition attractive. Now it felt like living with a machine programmed solely for acquisition and advancement. "There's the hospital board," Rich said, steering them toward a cluster of distinguished-looking couples near the silent auction tables. "Victoria, remember what we discussed about the pediatric wing. Personal touches, but nothing too emotional." As they approached the group, Victoria noticed Elena again, this time speaking with the hospital's chief of staff. Whatever she was saying had his complete attention, and he was nodding enthusiastically. Elena caught Victoria looking and offered another brilliant smile, raising her champagne glass in a subtle toast. The gesture felt like a challenge, though Victoria couldn't say why. "Dr. Patterson," Rich said, extending his hand to the chief of staff. "Richard Hammond, this is my wife, Victoria." "Mr. Hammond, Mrs. Hammond," Dr. Patterson replied warmly. "We're so grateful for your generosity. The new pediatric wing will transform our ability to serve young patients." "It's our pleasure," Rich said smoothly. "Family means everything to us. This seemed like a natural way to give back to the community." Victoria smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, playing her part in the familiar dance. But her attention kept drifting to Elena, who had moved to another group but remained visible across the room. There was something about the other woman's presence that felt like a splinter under the skin, small but persistent and increasingly uncomfortable. The baby kicked sharply, and Victoria gasped softly, one hand flying to her side. "Are you all right, dear?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife. "Just active tonight," Victoria said, rubbing the spot where her daughter's foot had connected with her ribs. "She seems to have strong opinions about formal events." The group laughed politely, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But Victoria found herself struggling to focus on the small talk about vacation homes and charity committees. Her mind kept circling back to the look she'd seen pass between Rich and Elena, the casual intimacy of their body language, the way Elena moved through this event as if she had every right to be here. At the gala, Victoria would learn that some cages were made of gold, others were made of lies, and tonight, both would shatter in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the cocktail hour continued, Victoria excused herself to the restroom, needing a moment away from the constant performance. In the marble-clad ladies' lounge, she studied her reflection once more. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger sometimes. Where had the art gallery curator gone? The woman who'd once had opinions and dreams that extended beyond being the perfect wife to a successful man? She checked her phone again. Lock, unlock, lock. The motion had become automatic, a nervous tick she couldn't seem to break. No new messages, nothing urgent requiring her attention, just the habitual need to verify that her small connection to the outside world remained intact. When she returned to the ballroom, dinner service was beginning. Rich was already seated at their table, deep in conversation with the other couples about market trends and investment opportunities. Elena had somehow ended up at a table directly in their line of sight, positioned where Victoria couldn't help but notice her throughout the meal. As Victoria took her seat, the baby delivered another sharp kick, this one strong enough to make her wince visibly. "Everything all right?" Rich asked, though his attention was already drifting back to his conversation about municipal bonds. "Fine," Victoria replied, settling her napkin across her lap. "Just a restless night for both of us, it seems." But even as she spoke the words, Victoria realized that nothing about tonight felt fine. Something was building, like the atmospheric pressure before a storm. She just couldn't yet see the shape of what was coming. The ballroom gleamed with old money and new power, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables laden with fine china and fresh flowers. Victoria navigated the pre-dinner conversations with practiced ease, her smile never wavering despite the growing discomfort in her lower back. She'd mastered this performance over 6 years of marriage to Rich, learning to be charming but not too witty, engaged but never opinionated. "Victoria, darling, you absolutely glow," gushed Mrs. Whitmore, a woman whose husband owned half the commercial real estate downtown. "When are you due?" "6 weeks," Victoria replied, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "We're very excited." "Your first?" The question always stung, though Victoria had learned to hide her reaction. "Yes, our first together. Rich has a son from his previous marriage." Mrs. Whitmore nodded knowingly. "Second families can be such a blessing. My Harold was 43 when we had our youngest. Sometimes a man needs to mature before he truly appreciates fatherhood." The comment hit closer to home than Victoria cared to admit. Rich had been largely absent during Thomas's early years, building his business empire while his first wife managed the actual parenting. He claimed he'd learned from those mistakes, promised this time would be different. But watching him tonight, already working the room while she managed the social pleasantries, Victoria wondered if people ever really changed their fundamental nature. "Mrs. Hammond, A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Elena Cartwright appeared at her elbow, champagne glass in hand, and that same knowing smile playing at her lips. Congratulations on the baby. Rich has told me so much about your situation. The word situation landed like ice water down Victoria's spine. She studied Elena's face, searching for some clue about what exactly Rich had shared about their marriage, their pregnancy, their private life. Thank you, Victoria managed. I didn't realize you and Rich discussed personal matters. Elena's laugh was light, musical. Oh, we discuss everything. Business partnerships require such trust. Don't you think complete transparency? Something in Elena's tone made Victoria's stomach clench. The baby seemed to sense her tension, rolling and stretching uncomfortably against her ribs. Of course, Victoria said carefully. Though I imagine most business discussions focus on financial matters rather than family planning. You'd be surprised, Elena replied, her eyes glittering with what might have been amusement. The personal and professional intersect in fascinating ways, especially when planning for the future. Before Victoria could respond, Rich appeared at her side, his hand settling possessively on her lower back. Elena, I see you've met my wife properly, he said, though something in his voice suggested this meeting wasn't entirely coincidental. We were just discussing transparency in business relationships, Elena said smoothly, and future planning. Rich's fingers pressed slightly harder against Victoria's spine. Elena's been invaluable in structuring our expansion into Caribbean markets. Very forward-thinking approach to asset management. The conversation felt loaded with subtext Victoria couldn't decipher, like listening to a foreign language where she recognized individual words but missed the full meaning. Elena and Rich stood just slightly too close, their body language suggesting a familiarity that extended beyond professional collaboration. I should return to my table, Elena said. The silent auction closes soon, and I have my eye on that lovely Tuscany vacation package. Perfect for a romantic getaway. She walked away with the fluid confidence of a woman comfortable in her own skin, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and unanswered questions. She seems involved in your business, Victoria observed. She's very dedicated, Rich replied, but his eyes followed Elena's progress across the room. Now, shall we find our seats? Dinner service is about to begin. Their table included Dr. and Mrs. Patterson from the hospital board, the Whitmores, and two other couples whose names Victoria immediately forgot. The conversation flowed around topics she'd heard countless times before: market volatility, vacation home purchases, children's private school applications. She contributed when expected, laughed at the appropriate moments, and tried to ignore the growing ache in her lower back. Halfway through the salad course, Victoria excused herself for another trip to the restroom. The ladies' lounge was blessedly quiet, a refuge from the constant social performance. She gripped the marble countertop and studied her reflection, noting the tightness around her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite conceal. I'm not imagining the cruelty, she thought. This is real. The validation came like a whisper of relief. For months, she'd questioned her own perceptions, wondering if pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid or oversensitive. But the interaction with Elena had crystallized something she'd been trying to ignore, the growing sense that she was being systematically excluded from her own life. As she prepared to return to the dining room, the restroom door opened and two women entered, their voices carrying the particular tone of gossip shared between old friends. Did you see Richard Hammond's wife tonight? One said. She looks exhausted. Poor thing, the other replied. Though honestly, at her age, pregnancy is challenging under the best circumstances, and with Richard's reputation. Victoria froze in the stall, her breath catching. You don't think he's actually changed, do you? The first woman continued. I mean, once a cheater. Shh, the second woman hissed. She could be in here. She's at dinner. I just saw her picking at her salmon. Anyway, I'm just saying, she always knows last. They always know last. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She remained perfectly still until the women finished their business and left, then emerged from the stall on shaking legs. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman barely holding herself together, the careful composure cracking around the edges. When she returned to the table, Rich was regaling the group with a story about a difficult client, his charm on full display. He glanced up as she sat down, his smile never faltering. "Feeling better?" he asked. "Much," she lied. But as the meal continued, Victoria found herself studying the other couples at their table, noting the casual intimacy between the long-married pairs, the way they included each other in conversations and shared private jokes. When had she and Rich stopped being a team and become co-performers in an elaborate show? Elena was clearly visible from their table, animated in conversation with her dinner companions. Every so often, Victoria caught her looking in their direction, not at the table in general, but specifically at Rich. And each time, Rich seemed aware of the attention, straightening slightly or adjusting his tie. During the main course, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it discreetly, expecting maybe a message from Thomas or her friend Grace. Instead, she saw a notification from Rich's credit card company about a recent charge. Strange, since those notifications usually went only to his phone. The charge was from an expensive restaurant downtown. Yesterday evening. Victoria remembered yesterday clearly because Rich had claimed to be working late on the Peterson deal, grabbing dinner at his desk. She'd waited until nearly 10 o'clock before eating alone, the carefully prepared meal growing cold as she watched the clock. Another kick from the baby, stronger this time, made her gasp softly. The movement felt different somehow, more urgent and uncomfortable than the usual stretching and rolling. "Victoria." Mrs. Patterson leaned toward her with concern. "Are you quite all right? You've gone rather pale." "Just tired," Victoria managed. "It's been a long day." But even as she spoke, she realized that exhaustion was only part of what she was feeling. The pieces of a puzzle she'd been unconsciously assembling for months were finally clicking into place: the late nights, the mysterious phone calls, the business trips that seemed to require more and more time away from home, Elena's easy familiarity with Rich's schedule and preferences, the way he'd been increasingly distant and critical, as if preparing for some inevitable separation. The recognition pain flooded through her like ice water. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't pregnancy hormones making her oversensitive. This was happening, had probably been happening for longer than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge. As dessert was served, Rich's phone buzzed with a call. He glanced at the screen, then at Victoria. "I need to take this," he said. Peterson's having second thoughts about the timeline. But as he stepped away from the table, Victoria noticed Elena excuse herself from her own dinner companions at almost exactly the same moment. Through the ballroom's glass doors, she could see them in the hotel lobby, standing closer together than any business conversation required. Rich's hand rested on Elena's arm as they spoke, his body language intimate and familiar. Victoria sat perfectly still, forcing herself to continue the conversation about the hospital's new equipment needs while her world quietly crumbled around her. The baby kicked again, and this time the sensation was accompanied by a sharp cramp that made her grip the edge of the table. When Rich returned 10 minutes later, he smelled faintly of Elena's perfume. "Crisis averted," he announced to the table, sliding back into his chair. "Sometimes clients need extra hand-holding." But as he spoke, Victoria caught Elena slipping back into the ballroom from the opposite entrance, her lipstick freshly applied and her hair slightly mussed despite the short duration of their supposed phone call. The evening's entertainment began as the dessert plates were cleared. A local singer took the small stage, performing classic standards while couples moved to the designated dance floor. Rich stood and offered Victoria his hand, the gesture automatic rather than romantic. "I'm not sure I'm up for dancing," Victoria said, another cramp making her shift uncomfortably in her chair. "Just one song," Rich insisted, "for appearances." The phrase crystallized everything Victoria had been feeling. For appearances. Not because he wanted to hold her, not because he enjoyed dancing with his pregnant wife, but because their absence from the dance floor might be noticed and commented upon. They moved together with practiced efficiency, Victoria's hand in his other hand resting carefully on her back to avoid her rounded belly. To anyone watching, they looked like a devoted couple sharing a tender moment, but Victoria could feel the distance between them, could sense Rich's attention divided even as they swayed to the music. "Elena seems very invested in your business success," Victoria said quietly. "She's ambitious," Rich replied. "I respect that in a business partner." "Is that all she is? A business partner?" Rich's hand tightened slightly on her back. "What kind of question is that? The kind a wife asks when she notices things?" Victoria replied, surprised by her own directness. You're being paranoid, Rich said, his voice cooling. Pregnancy hormones can make women imagine all sorts of things. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that Victoria almost accepted it automatically. Almost. But the woman's voice from the restroom echoed in her mind. They always know last. I'm not imagining the charge from Chez Laurent yesterday, Victoria said quietly. The restaurant where you definitely weren't having a working dinner. Rich missed a step, his rhythm faltering almost imperceptibly. You're monitoring my credit card statements now. The notification came to my phone by mistake, Victoria replied. Though that's not really the point, is it? The song ended, and Rich stepped back from her immediately, his public smile snapping back into place as other couples continued dancing around them. We'll discuss this at home, he said, his voice low and warning. Tonight is about the hospital, not your insecurities. Howdy, but as he guided her back to their table, Victoria caught Elena watching them from across the room. The other woman's expression was knowing, almost satisfied, as if she'd witnessed exactly what she'd expected to see. The cramp that hit Victoria as she sat down was strong enough to make her breath catch. Different from the baby's movements, sharper and more concerning. She pressed her hand to her belly, trying to determine if this was something she should worry about, or just the stress of the evening manifesting physically. The program continued with speeches from hospital administrators and major donors, but Victoria found it increasingly difficult to focus on the words. Her body felt strange, restless and uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with her usual pregnancy complaints. And her mind kept circling back to Elena's knowing smile, Rich's defensive reaction to her questions, and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed life was built on foundations far shakier than she'd ever allowed herself to acknowledge. As the evening progressed toward its climax, Victoria realized she was no longer just a pregnant woman attending a charity gala with her husband. She was a woman on the verge of discovering truths she wasn't sure she was prepared to face, carrying a child whose father might already be planning a future that didn't include either of them. The recognition was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that falling might be the only way forward. The applause died down as Rich stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the ballroom. Victoria watched from her seat at the head table, her hands folded over her belly, trying to ignore the increasingly uncomfortable cramping that had started during dessert. Ladies and gentlemen, Rich began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. Tonight represents more than just a charitable donation. It represents our commitment to the future, to the children who will benefit from the world-class care this new pediatric wing will provide. Victoria had heard him practice this speech at home, perfecting the pauses and inflections that would maximize emotional impact. He was gifted at this, at reading a room and delivering exactly what his audience wanted to hear. It was one of the qualities that had first attracted her to him, this ability to make people believe in his vision. My beautiful wife Victoria and I, Rich continued, gesturing toward her with practiced warmth, are thrilled to announce our partnership with Winterfield Children's Hospital. Family means everything to us. Every child deserves the best possible start in life, and we're honored to help make that possible. The spotlight found Victoria, and she smiled reflexively, raising one hand in a small wave. The audience applauded, and she felt the familiar flush of public attention. But underneath the performance, her mind was processing the words Rich had chosen. Our partnership. Family means everything to us. The lies delivered with such conviction that even she almost believed them. The Hammond Family Pediatric Wing will feature state-of-the-art equipment, private family rooms, and dedicated spaces for siblings and extended family members. Rich continued, because healing happens best when families can stay together during the most challenging times. Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly as another cramp seized her. The baby had been unusually active all evening, and now these new sensations were layering on top of the constant movement. She tried to breathe through the discomfort, maintaining her smile as cameras flashed and the audience hung on Rich's every word. As the speech continued, Victoria found herself studying the faces in the crowd. Dr. Patterson looked genuinely moved by Rich's words about family togetherness. Margaret Hammond nodded approvingly from her table near the front, and Elena Cartwright watched from across the room with that same knowing expression that had been making Victoria increasingly uncomfortable all evening. The photographers moved closer for better shots, and Victoria automatically adjusted her posture, angling her body the way Rich had taught her years ago. Shoulders back, chin slightly raised, one hand placed gently on her pregnant belly to emphasize the maternal angle. The mental checklist ran automatically. Smile, but not too broadly. Look adoring, but not vacant. Project warmth and approachability while maintaining dignity. She'd perfected this performance over 6 years of marriage, learning to be the perfect accessory to Rich's ambitions. But tonight, with each practiced pose and calculated expression, she felt increasingly disconnected from the woman she'd once been. When had she stopped being Victoria and become simply Mrs. Richard Hammond? Now, I'd like to invite Elena Cartwright, our international business development specialist, to join us for a photograph, Rich announced. Elena has been instrumental in structuring the financial aspects of this donation, ensuring maximum impact for our investment. Victoria's smile faltered slightly as Elena glided toward the podium, her red hair catching the stage lights like fire. She positioned herself on Rich's other side, close enough that their shoulders touched, while Victoria remained seated due to her advanced pregnancy. The photographer called out instructions. "Mr. Hammond, if you could put your hand on your wife's shoulder, Mrs. Cartwright, perhaps lean in slightly for the group shot." As they arranged themselves for the photos, Elena leaned close to Victoria under the guise of positioning for the camera. "You must be so tired," Elena whispered, her voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. "Pregnancy is exhausting, especially at your age. I can't imagine trying to keep up with Richard's schedule while carrying all that extra weight." Victoria was 32 years old. Elena knew this perfectly well. The words were delivered with the appearance of sympathy, but they landed like small, precise cuts. Victoria maintained her smile for the cameras while processing the casual cruelty of the comment. Elena's implication was clear: Victoria was becoming a burden, a complication in Rich's increasingly complex life. "Smile a bit wider, Mrs. Hammond," called the photographer. "This one's for the society pages." Victoria complied, her face aching from the sustained expression of joy and gratitude. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying every interaction she'd had with Elena over the past 18 months. The business lunches she'd been excluded from, the weekend work sessions that seemed to require Elena's presence at their home, the way Elena spoke about Rich's plans and preferences with an intimacy that suggested knowledge extending far beyond professional collaboration. Another photographer joined the first, and the session continued. Victoria watched Elena work the camera with professional skill, her poses natural and confident. When had Victoria lost that ease, that comfort in her own skin? She remembered being confident once, passionate about her work at the art gallery, excited about building a life with Rich. Now she felt like a supporting character in someone else's story. "That should do it," Rich announced, stepping back from the podium. "Thank you all for your continued support." The applause was thunderous, and Victoria struggled to her feet to acknowledge it properly. The movement sent another sharp cramp through her lower abdomen, stronger than the previous ones. She gripped Rich's offered arm, using him for balance as much as for show. As they made their way back to their table, Victoria overheard fragments of conversation from the crowd. "Such a generous couple. That business partner of his is stunning. She looks ready to pop. I heard she's been having complications." The last comment stopped Victoria cold. Complications. She hadn't mentioned any health concerns to anyone outside her immediate medical team. How would rumors about her pregnancy be circulating among Rich's business associates during the brief break before the evening's final presentations? Rich was immediately surrounded by congratulatory colleagues and potential clients. Victoria found herself momentarily alone at their table, watching the social dance continue around her. Elena appeared at her elbow with surprising stealth. "That went beautifully," Elena said, settling into the empty chair beside Victoria. "Richard is so gifted at public speaking. You're lucky to have such a charismatic husband." "Yes," Victoria replied carefully. "He's very dedicated to his work." "We all are," Elena said, her smile sharp. "Success requires sacrifice. Don't you think sometimes we have to prioritize the future over present comfort?" Before Victoria could respond to this cryptic comment, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen. Dr. Mitchell's office. Strange for them to call so late in the evening. "I should take this," Victoria said, struggling to her feet again. Of course, Elena replied. I'll keep Richard company. Victoria made her way to a quieter area near the ballroom's entrance, pressing the phone to her ear. Mrs. Hammond, this is Dr. Mitchell's answering service. We received some concerning lab results from your blood work yesterday. The doctor wants to see you first thing Monday morning. Victoria's free hand moved to her belly. What kind of concerning results? I'm not authorized to discuss specifics over the phone, but Dr. Mitchell did mark it as priority. Please call the office Monday to schedule the earliest available appointment. The call ended, leaving Victoria staring at her phone in growing unease. She'd had routine blood work done 2 days ago, standard monitoring for her stage of pregnancy. What could have shown up in those results that required urgent follow-up? Another cramp. This one strong enough to make her gasp. Doubled her over slightly. A passing waiter noticed her distress. Ma'am, are you all right? Should I call someone? I'm fine, Victoria managed, though she was beginning to doubt that was true. Just tired. She looked back toward their table and saw Elena leaning close to Rich, their heads nearly touching as they spoke in what appeared to be urgent whispers. Rich's expression was serious, focused entirely on whatever Elena was telling him. When Elena placed her hand on his arm in a gesture of support or emphasis, he didn't pull away. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the careful construction of denial she'd been maintaining. The woman from the restroom had been right, she always knew last. The wife was always the last to acknowledge what everyone else could see clearly. A memory surfaced unbidden from 6 months ago. She'd returned home early from a doctor's appointment to find Elena in their kitchen, making coffee as if she belonged there. Rich had explained that they'd been working on financial projections, and Elena had offered to handle refreshments while he took an important call. Nothing inappropriate, just business efficiency. But now Victoria remembered details she'd suppressed at the time. Elena's intimate knowledge of where they kept the coffee and mugs, the way she'd been standing barefoot on their marble floor, her shoes neatly placed by the back door as if she'd planned to stay for a while, the slight flush in Rich's face when Victoria had appeared unexpectedly. Another memory 3 months ago, finding Elena's earring in the guest bathroom. Rich had explained that Elena had felt dizzy during a long work session and had splashed water on her face. The earring must have fallen out then. Perfectly reasonable explanation. But the earring had been on the bathroom counter, not the floor. And it was an expensive piece. The kind of jewelry a woman would notice missing immediately. How long would someone have to spend in a bathroom to remove earrings and forget to put them back on? The cramp that hit next was strong enough to make Victoria cry out softly. A middle-aged woman in an elegant black dress approached with concern. Honey, you look like you're in distress. I'm a nurse. Can I help? Victoria looked into the woman's kind eyes and felt tears threaten for the first time all evening. I think something might be wrong. With the baby, the woman's expression grew serious. How far along are you? 36 weeks. Any bleeding, regular contractions? No bleeding, but these cramps, they're different from usual. Sharper. The woman glanced around the ballroom, then back at Victoria. Is your husband here? Your doctor. Victoria followed her gaze to where Rich remained, deep in conversation with Elena, both of them oblivious to her distress. He's busy, Victoria said, the words tasting bitter. I'm not crazy, she thought with sudden clarity. I know what I'm seeing. The validation came like a flood of relief and terror. She wasn't imagining Rich's emotional distance. She wasn't paranoid about Elena's increasingly prominent role in their lives, and she wasn't overreacting to the physical symptoms that were escalating by the minute. I think, Victoria said slowly, I need to get to a hospital. But even as she spoke the words, another part of her mind was calculating the social implications. The gala wasn't over. Rich's speech had been a success, but the networking portion of the evening was just beginning. These were crucial business relationships, potential deals worth millions of dollars. If she made a scene now, if she demanded Rich's attention for what might turn out to be false labor or stress-induced cramping, she would be the wife who embarrassed her husband at his moment of professional triumph. She would be the complication that interfered with his success. The mental programming ran deep. 6 years of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize Rich's needs over her own comfort, his reputation over her instincts. But as she stood there, one hand pressed to her belly and the other gripping a nearby table for support, Victoria realized that she was tired of being a supporting character. She was tired of performing perfect wife while her husband built a life that increasingly excluded her, and she was tired of ignoring her own needs for the sake of appearances. The baby gave a particularly strong kick, as if agreeing with her mother's assessment. Whatever was happening tonight, Victoria was going to face it on her own terms, not as an accessory to someone else's agenda. As she made her way back toward the table to collect Rich, Victoria caught Elena's eye across the room. The other woman's smile was radiant, triumphant, as if she'd just received exactly the news she'd been hoping for. And for the first time all evening, Victoria smiled back. Not the practiced, pleasant expression she'd perfected for social occasions, but something fiercer and more honest. If Elena wanted to play games, Victoria was finally ready to learn the rules. Victoria made it through the fish course, picking methodically at the herb-crusted salmon, while Rich held court about commercial real estate markets and zoning regulations. The cramps had settled into an irregular pattern that she couldn't quite categorize as contractions, but they were persistent enough to make concentration difficult. Elena sat 3 tables away, but she might as well have been at their table, given how often Rich's attention drifted in her direction. When Elena excused herself to visit the restroom, Rich checked his phone. When she returned, he found a reason to step away for a business call. The synchronization was almost comical in its transparency. "More wine, Mrs. Hammond," asked their server, a young man who looked barely old enough to be working such an upscale event. "Just water, please," Victoria replied, noting how her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "Mrs. Patterson leaned closer with concern. "You've barely touched your dinner, dear. The salmon is quite good." "I'm afraid my appetite hasn't been reliable lately," Victoria said, which was true enough. Food had lost much of its appeal over the past few weeks, though she'd attributed that to normal late pregnancy discomfort rather than the growing knot of anxiety that seemed to have taken permanent residence in her chest. Margaret Hammond's sharp voice cut across the table conversation. "You're looking rather peaked, Victoria. Very unflattering in this lighting." The comment landed with Margaret's usual precision, designed to wound while maintaining the appearance of grandmotherly concern. Dr. Patterson frowned at his wife's mother-in-law, clearly uncomfortable with the casual cruelty. "Actually, I think Victoria looks radiant," he said diplomatically. "Pregnancy suits her." "If you say so," Margaret replied with a dismissive wave of her jeweled hand. "Though I do hope she's being sensible about her condition. Some women use pregnancy as an excuse for all sorts of dramatic behavior." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Thomas appeared at her shoulder. Rich's 16-year-old son had grown nearly as tall as his father over the past year, though he carried himself with the slightly awkward grace of adolescence. "Hey, stepmom," Thomas said, his voice carrying genuine concern. "You look like you're about to puke. Want me to get Dad?" Victoria glanced toward where Rich stood near the silent auction tables, his hand resting on Elena's lower back as they examined a vacation package to the Bahamas. The gesture was intimate, possessive, the kind of unconscious touching that spoke of familiarity and comfort. "He's busy," Victoria managed. Thomas followed her gaze and his expression darkened. At 16, he was old enough to recognize the signs of adult complications, even if he lacked the vocabulary to address them directly. "Oh," he said quietly, "that kind of busy." The simple acknowledgement hit Victoria like a physical blow. If Rich's teenage son could see what was happening, how long had everyone else been aware? How long had she been the only person at this gathering who didn't understand the true nature of Rich's relationship with Elena? "You know she's not just his business partner, right?" Thomas said, his voice low enough that the other table occupants couldn't hear. Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. The validation she'd been seeking came from an unexpected source, but it was no less devastating for being anticipated. "I'm beginning to understand that," she replied carefully. Thomas glanced around the table, ensuring they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. "I heard them talking on the phone last week. Dad and her. It wasn't about business." Another cramp seized Victoria's lower abdomen, this one strong enough to make her grip the edge of the table. Thomas noticed immediately. "Seriously, are you okay? Should I get someone?" "I think," Victoria paused, breathing through the discomfort. I think I need to get to a hospital, but I don't want to cause a scene. Screw the scene, Thomas said with surprising vehemence. You're pregnant and you're obviously in pain. Dad can deal with his own drama. The loyalty from her stepson was unexpected and deeply moving. Victoria had always gotten along well with Thomas, but his fierce protectiveness tonight revealed a depth of affection she hadn't fully appreciated. Let me get him, Thomas said, starting to rise. Wait, Victoria caught his arm. Let me try to get through the rest of dinner. If things get worse, then we'll interrupt his business discussions. Thomas studied her face with surprising maturity. You don't have to protect him. You know, not from his own choices. The insight was startling coming from someone barely old enough to drive, but Victoria realized that Thomas had been watching his father's patterns for much longer than she had, observing the way Rich compartmentalized his life and prioritized his wants over other people's needs. Rich returned to the table as the dessert course was being served, his hair slightly disheveled and his bow tie askew. He slid into his chair without explanation, immediately launching into a story about the auction items as if his extended absence hadn't been noticed. The Tuscany villa package is quite impressive, he said to the table generally. 2 weeks in a restored monastery with private vineyard tours. Perfect for couples looking for an intimate getaway. Victoria caught the way his eyes flicked briefly toward Elena's table as he spoke. The other woman was listening to something her dinner companion was saying, but her attention seemed similarly divided. Sounds romantic, Mrs. Whitmore said. Harold and I did something similar for our anniversary last year. There's something about European settings that just enhances the experience. Rich smiled. Exactly. Sometimes a change of scenery can completely transform your perspective on things. The comment felt loaded with meaning that had nothing to do with vacation planning. Victoria studied her husband's face, noting the flush in his cheeks and the slightly unfocused look in his eyes. He seemed energized in a way she hadn't seen in months, as if he'd just received very good news about something important. When is your next business trip? Victoria asked quietly. Rich's attention snapped to her with sharp focus. What? Your next business trip? You mentioned the Peterson deal closing next week. I assume that will require travel. Some, Rich replied cautiously. Nothing extended. Why do you ask? Just curious about your schedule. With the baby coming so soon, I like to know when you'll be available. Rich's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We'll discuss my travel calendar at home. Tonight isn't the time for logistical planning, but Victoria was no longer willing to be dismissed so easily. 6 years of accepting Rich's deflections and non-answers had taught her to recognize when he was being deliberately evasive. I noticed Elena mentioned something about Cayman Islands expansion earlier, Victoria pressed. Is that part of the Peterson deal? Rich's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Elena mentioned the Caymans. When she was talking about transparency in business partnerships, she seemed very knowledgeable about your expansion plans. The cramp that hit Victoria mid-sentence was strong enough to make her gasp audibly. Thomas immediately pushed his chair back, ready to act, but Victoria held up one hand to stop him. I'm fine, she managed. Though the lie was becoming harder to maintain, Rich looked at her with what might have been concern or annoyance. Maybe you should go home. You look exhausted. I think I should go to the hospital, Victoria replied. These cramps are getting stronger. It's probably just stress, Rich said dismissively. You've been anxious all week about tonight. Sometimes the mind creates physical symptoms. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that Victoria almost accepted it automatically. But Thomas's presence beside her served as a reality check, his teenage indignation radiating disapproval of his father's response. Dad, Thomas said sharply, she's saying she needs medical attention. Maybe listen to her. Rich's expression hardened. Thomas, this isn't your conversation. Actually, it kind of is, Thomas replied with surprising steel in his voice. Since you seem more interested in your business partner than your pregnant wife? The comment landed like a bomb at their table. Dr. Patterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Whitmore found sudden fascination with her tiramisu. Margaret Hammond's eyes glittered with the kind of interest that promised future gossip sessions. Excuse me, Rich said, his voice deadly quiet. What did you just say? But before Thomas could respond, the auction announcements began, drawing attention away from their family drama. Victoria used the distraction to breathe through another wave of cramping, her hands pressed firmly against her belly. The baby's movements had changed over the past hour, becoming less playful and more agitated. Instead of the usual rolling and stretching, she felt sharp jabs and what seemed like sustained pressure against her ribs and pelvis. Combined with the increasingly regular cramps, the sensations were beginning to feel ominous. As the auctioneer's voice filled the ballroom, calling out bids for weekend getaways and expensive art pieces, Victoria found herself calculating time intervals between cramps. 7 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes. Not quite regular enough to be true labor contractions, but not random enough to dismiss as false alarms either. Rich returned from the auction tables as the bidding concluded, his face flushed with what Victoria was beginning to recognize as the particular excitement he showed when a complex plan was falling into place. "Ready to make our exit?" he asked, but his tone suggested the question was rhetorical. Victoria struggled to her feet, immediately regretting the movement as another sharp cramp seized her. This one was strong enough to make her cry out softly, drawing concerned glances from nearby tables. "Rich," she said urgently, "something's really wrong. I need to get to a hospital now." Rich's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: annoyance, calculation, and finally resignation. But not, Victoria noticed, genuine concern for her welfare. "Nothing's wrong except your need for attention," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she and Thomas could hear. "You're being dramatic at the worst possible moment." The casual cruelty of the assessment hit Victoria like a physical slap. Here she was, 8 months pregnant and clearly in distress, and Rich's primary concern was how her condition might affect his social standing. Thomas stepped closer to Victoria, his young face tight with anger. "Dad, what the hell is wrong with you?" "Watch your language," Rich snapped, but his attention was already drifting back toward Elena's table. "And mind your own business." "This is my business," Thomas replied fiercely. "Victoria is family, and if you can't see that she needs help right now, then maybe I need to call someone who can." The threat hung in the air between father and son, loaded with implications about loyalty and protection that went far beyond the immediate medical crisis. Victoria realized that Thomas had chosen sides in a conflict that was just beginning to surface, and his choice had surprised them all. As another cramp built to a crescendo that left her breathless and shaking, Victoria understood that the evening had moved far beyond social performance and family drama. Something was seriously wrong with her pregnancy, and whether Rich acknowledged it or not, she was going to need medical attention very soon. The only question was whether she would have to face whatever was coming alone, or if the family she'd thought she could count on would finally step up when it mattered most. The final speech of the evening required Victoria to stand beside Rich as he delivered closing remarks to the assembled donors. The spotlights felt like interrogation lamps, too bright and too hot, making her already flushed face feel like it was burning. Victoria's vision blurred at the edges as she fought to maintain her composure. "And finally," Rich said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom, "to my beautiful wife Victoria, who reminds me daily what we're really fighting for the next generation." The applause was thunderous, washing over Victoria like a physical force. She forced her practiced smile wider, though her face felt like it might crack from the effort. The baby delivered a particularly vicious kick to her ribs, as if protesting the noise and lights and performance anxiety that seemed to permeate every public moment of Victoria's life. Rich's hand landed on her shoulder with what looked like affection, but felt like ownership. His fingers pressed into her skin just hard enough to hurt, a reminder of expectations and consequences that only she could feel. "Smile bigger," he whispered, his mouth close to her ear but his voice carrying a warning edge. "You look miserable up here." Victoria tried to comply, but another cramp was building in her lower abdomen, this one stronger than any that had come before. She gripped Rich's offered arm, using him for support as much as for show. "Rich, please," she managed through gritted teeth. "Something's really wrong." "There's nothing wrong except your attitude," Rich replied, his own smile never wavering as he waved to the crowd. 5 more minutes of playing the grateful wife. That's all I need." The dismissal was so casual, so practiced, that Victoria realized this wasn't the first time Rich had prioritized public perception over her well-being. How many times had she swallowed discomfort or concern because it might interfere with his professional image? How many times had she made herself smaller to ensure his success appeared larger? As Rich guided her to wave at the enthusiastic crowd, his grip on her arm tightened possessively. The beaded sleeve of her custom gown caught on his diamond cufflink, a gift from his first successful real estate deal, he told her proudly. Victoria felt the fabric strain against the caught decoration. "Rich, my dress!" She started to warn him, but he yanked her forward anyway. His attention focused entirely on acknowledging important faces in the crowd rather than his wife's predicament. The delicate silk tore with an audible ripping sound that seemed to echo through the ballroom despite the ongoing applause. The tear ran from shoulder to waist, exposing Victoria's maternity undergarments and the full curve of her pregnant belly to 300 of the city's most influential residents. Gasps rippled through the crowd as camera flashes continued, now capturing not a triumphant moment, but a humiliating accident. Victoria stood frozen, one hand instinctively trying to hold the ruined fabric together while the other remained trapped in Rich's grip. The exposure felt like more than just physical nakedness. It was as if all her carefully maintained facades had been stripped away in an instant, leaving her vulnerable and diminished before an audience of strangers. The panic-cleaning instinct kicked in immediately. Victoria began apologizing to everyone within earshot, as if the torn dress were somehow her fault rather than the result of Rich's careless handling. "I'm so sorry," she said to the photographer who was still taking pictures. "So sorry. This is embarrassing. I should have been more careful." Her conditioning ran so deep that even in her moment of public humiliation, Victoria's first impulse was to absorb blame and minimize disruption. She apologized to the people who were staring at her exposed body, to the event organizers who now had to manage an unexpected crisis, to Rich, whose perfect evening had been marred by his wife's clumsiness. Rich's face had turned crimson, but not from embarrassment for Victoria's situation. His expression showed pure rage at being embarrassed, at having his moment of professional triumph overshadowed by what he would undoubtedly characterize as his wife's inability to handle basic social functions. Hotel staff appeared with remarkable speed, carrying towels and offering assistance. Dr. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd, his medical training overriding social protocol. "Mrs. Hammond, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice cutting through the ambient confusion. But before Victoria could answer, she felt an unmistakable sensation between her legs. Not another cramp, but the warm gush of amniotic fluid that every pregnant woman recognizes instinctively. Her water had broken, adding liquid embarrassment to her already overwhelming exposure. The fluid pooled at her feet, mixing with the torn silk of her ruined gown. Victoria stared down at the spreading wetness, her mind struggling to process that this was actually happening. Here, now, in front of everyone who mattered to Rich's career and social standing. "Oh my God," she whispered, her free hand moving to her belly as the reality of the situation crashed over her. Rich stepped back from her immediately, as if her condition might be contagious. His expression showed disgust rather than concern, embarrassment rather than protectiveness. This was the father of her unborn child, the man who had promised to love and support her through sickness and health, and he was looking at her like she was an inconvenience that had ruined his evening. The crowd's murmur grew louder as people began to understand what they were witnessing. Cell phones appeared, capturing what would undoubtedly become gossip fodder for months to come. Victoria Hammond, the real estate mogul's wife, falling apart at the city's most prestigious charity event. Elena Cartwright appeared through the crowd with that same knowing smile she'd worn all evening. But now there was something almost triumphant in her expression. "Oh my," Elena said, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to be overheard by nearby guests. "What a dramatic ending to such a lovely evening." The comment was delivered with apparent sympathy, but Victoria caught the satisfaction underneath. Elena was pleased by this turn of events, delighted to see Victoria's careful composure finally shatter in such a spectacular fashion. Deep vulnerability crashed over Victoria like a physical weight. She stood in front of 300 people, her expensive dress torn and ruined, amniotic fluid soaking through her undergarments, while her husband looked at her with disgust and his mistress looked entertained by the spectacle. This was rock bottom, Victoria realized. This was what complete powerlessness felt like. But even as she stood there, exposed and humiliated, something else began to surface alongside the shame. A small, fierce flame of anger that had been building for months finally found oxygen to burn brighter. Rich had done this to her. Not the dress tearing that might have been accidental, but everything else. The dismissal of her concerns, the gaslighting about her symptoms, the public prioritization of his image over her well-being, the months of emotional neglect that had led to this moment where she stood alone in a crowd, going into labor without her husband's support or protection. "Call an ambulance," Dr. Patterson was saying to someone, "and clear some space around her." Thomas appeared at Victoria's side, having pushed through the crowd with determined urgency. "Victoria, I called 911. They're on their way." His 16-year-old face was tight with concern and anger, offering more genuine care than she'd received from Rich all evening. The contrast was devastating and clarifying. "Thank you," Victoria managed, gripping Thomas's offered hand. Rich finally seemed to remember his role as concerned husband, stepping closer with what looked like appropriate worry to anyone watching from a distance. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, but his voice carried the tone of someone going through the motions rather than genuine emotional investment. Victoria looked at him, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in months. The face she'd once found handsome and charming now seemed calculating and cold. The man she'd thought she'd married was nowhere to be found in this stranger who prioritized appearances over authenticity, success over love. "You can stop pretending you care," Victoria said quietly, her voice steady despite everything that was happening to her body. Rich's carefully constructed public mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly and resentful underneath. "Victoria, you're being hysterical. This isn't the time." "No," Victoria interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is exactly the time. For once in our marriage, I'm going to say what I actually think instead of what you want to hear." The paramedics arrived as Victoria was speaking, their professional competence cutting through the social awkwardness like a blade. They surrounded her with equipment and questions, transforming her from a social spectacle into a medical patient requiring immediate attention. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, Victoria caught sight of Elena in the crowd. The other woman was no longer smiling. Instead, she was watching Rich's face with calculating intensity, as if gauging how this development might affect whatever plans they'd been making together. The realization hit Victoria with startling clarity. Elena wasn't just interested in Rich romantically or professionally. She was interested in what Rich's life might look like without Victoria in it. Tonight's disaster wasn't an unfortunate accident. It was an opportunity, a chance to accelerate whatever timeline they'd already established for Victoria's exit from Rich's life. But as the stretcher rolled toward the ballroom exit, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of her own power beginning to return. She was done performing, done apologizing, done making herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. Her daughter was about to be born, and Victoria was going to meet her as a woman who had finally stopped pretending that her marriage was something it had never actually been. Whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her voice clear. No more lies, no more performance, no more protecting Rich from the consequences of his own choices. The golden cage was finally breaking apart, and Victoria discovered she was ready to fly. The ballroom erupted in controlled chaos as hotel staff materialized with towels and blankets, while guests maintained the careful distance that money and breeding demanded during someone else's crisis. Victoria lay on the stretcher, wrapped in a hotel bathrobe that smelled like industrial laundry detergent, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the fear that had been building all evening. Rich stood frozen near the podium, more concerned with damage control than his wife's condition. Victoria could see him calculating the social implications, weighing his options for salvaging what remained of the evening's networking opportunities. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell," said a woman in an elegant black dress who'd appeared at Victoria's side. "I'm on the hospital board, but more importantly, I'm an obstetrician. I was in the audience when this happened." Victoria focused on Dr. Mitchell's calm brown eyes, grateful for professional competence in the midst of social catastrophe. "How far apart are the contractions?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her fingers finding Victoria's pulse with practiced efficiency. "I don't know," Victoria admitted. I thought they were just cramps from stress. I didn't want to make a scene. Dr. Mitchell's expression shifted slightly, and Victoria caught a flicker of something that might have been recognition or sympathy. You know, Dr. Mitchell said quietly as she checked Victoria's blood pressure. I've always wondered how you managed to look so calm at all these events. Now I understand you've been performing through pain for months. The observation hit Victoria like a diagnosis she hadn't known she needed. Performing through pain? Yes. That described not just tonight, but the entire past year of her marriage. Smiling through Rich's increasing emotional distance, making excuses for his late nights and mysterious phone calls, pretending that his criticism was concern and his control was protection. The friend who says I never liked him anyway. Dr. Mitchell had just become that friend, the one who saw through Rich's charm to something less attractive underneath. Can you tell me what's been happening tonight? Dr. Mitchell continued as the paramedics prepared to transfer Victoria to the ambulance. Victoria glanced toward Rich, who was now on his phone, undoubtedly spinning the evening's events into something more manageable for tomorrow's gossip circuits. My husband tore my dress during the final speech, Victoria said quietly. And then my water broke in front of 300 people. I saw that, Dr. Mitchell replied. What I meant was, what's been happening with your pregnancy? Any unusual symptoms lately? Changes in movement patterns? Elevated blood pressure? The questions opened a floodgate Victoria hadn't realized she'd been holding back. The baby's been more active, restless, and I've been having these episodes where I feel dizzy and disconnected, like I'm watching my life happen to someone else. My doctor said it was normal pregnancy fatigue. But you knew it was something more, Dr. Mitchell finished. Yes, Victoria whispered, relief flooding through her at finally being heard and believed. The paramedics were ready to move, but Victoria realized Rich hadn't approached the stretcher yet. She turned to look for him and found him still standing near the podium, now in animated conversation with Elena Cartwright. Elena had somehow made it into the circle of crisis management, positioning herself as the helpful family friend who would assist Rich through this difficult situation. She stood close enough to Rich that their shoulders touched, her hand resting on his arm in a gesture of support that looked entirely appropriate to casual observers. Mrs. Hammond, one of the paramedics said, is your husband riding with us to the hospital? Victoria looked again at Rich and Elena, noting how they leaned toward each other as they spoke, how Elena's fingers traced small, comforting circles on Rich's sleeve. They looked like what they were, two people who knew each other intimately, supporting each other through an unexpected crisis. I don't think so, Victoria said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. In the ambulance, Rich did eventually join her, but his attention remained divided between his phone and whatever crisis management strategy he and Elena had developed. Elena had also somehow secured a place in the ambulance. Despite having no medical training or family relationship that would justify her presence, this isn't about the baby, Victoria realized with sudden, painful clarity. This is about his image. I'm just collateral damage. The validation came like a whisper of truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. Rich's concern wasn't for her welfare or their daughter's safety. It was for how this evening's events might affect his carefully cultivated reputation as a successful family man. At the hospital, the labor and delivery unit buzzed with efficient activity. Victoria was transferred to a private room where monitors began tracking her contractions and the baby's heart rate. The medical environment felt safe and honest after hours of social performance. Elena attempted to follow them into the delivery room, positioning herself as the helpful family friend who could assist during the medical emergency. I'll just wait here in case Richard needs anything, Elena said, settling into the guest chair as if she belonged there. Victoria had spent 6 years accommodating other people's comfort, prioritizing their needs over her own instincts, but something fundamental had shifted during the ambulance ride. Maybe it was the honesty of labor pain, or the clarity that came from having her worst fears confirmed, but Victoria finally found her voice. Get her out, she said firmly. Rich looked up from his phone. Elena's here to help. Victoria's next contraction built to a crescendo that left her breathless, but she used the pain to focus her resolve rather than weaken it. Get her out now. The words carried an authority Victoria hadn't known she possessed. Elena's carefully composed expression flickered with surprise and something that might have been respect. Of course, Elena said smoothly. I'll wait in the family area in case you need anything. But as she moved toward the door, Elena paused beside Victoria's bed and leaned down as if to offer a friendly goodbye. This changes nothing, Elena whispered, her voice low enough that only Victoria could hear. Rich and I have plans that go far beyond tonight. The threat was delivered with Elena's characteristic polish, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Victoria was being warned that her pregnancy complications wouldn't derail whatever timeline Rich and Elena had established for their future together. As Elena left the room, Victoria felt the quiet strength beginning to emerge that would carry her through whatever came next. The labor pain was honest pain. Unlike the emotional anguish she'd been minimizing and rationalizing for months, her body was doing exactly what it was designed to do, bringing her daughter safely into the world. But even as she prepared to give birth, Victoria's mind was processing the evening's revelations with new clarity. Rich's emotional distance wasn't temporary stress from work, it was preparation for leaving. Elena's involvement in their lives wasn't professional collaboration, it was an audition for Victoria's replacement. And the financial irregularities Victoria had noticed weren't business expansion, they were asset protection in anticipation of divorce proceedings. Dr. Mitchell appeared in scrubs, her earlier formal gown replaced by the practical uniform of medical necessity. "How are we doing?" "Victoria," she asked, checking the monitors and examining Victoria's progress. "I think," Victoria said between contractions, "I'm about to become a single mother." Dr. Mitchell's eyes met hers with understanding. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a woman is realizing she's stronger than she thought she was. As the night progressed and labor intensified, Victoria began to understand that she wasn't just giving birth to her daughter. She was also giving birth to a new version of herself, a woman who would no longer accept lies as love or control as care. The baby was coming whether Rich was emotionally present or not, and Victoria was going to meet her daughter as a mother who had finally stopped pretending that her marriage was something it had never actually been. Whatever Elena and Rich had planned for their future, they were about to discover that Victoria Hammond was not going to disappear quietly into their preferred version of events. She had her own plans now, and they began with bringing her daughter safely into the world. Labor progressed with the relentless efficiency of a process that had no regard for social convenience or emotional preparedness. Victoria's world narrowed to the rhythm of contractions and the increasingly urgent beeping of monitoring equipment that tracked both her vital signs and her daughter's. Between the waves of pain, Victoria's mind processed months of suppressed observations with startling clarity. Rich's business trips that seemed to require more overnight stays than geography could justify. Elena's intimate knowledge of their home routines, from the coffee maker's quirks to the security system's codes. The way Rich had started speaking about their future in conditional terms, as if their marriage were a business venture that might not prove profitable long-term. Thomas arrived at the hospital near midnight, his teenage face tight with worry and an adult-sized anger that made him seem older than his 16 years. "Victoria, I called Grace," he said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "Your college friend, I found her number in your phone contacts. She's flying in from Chicago on the first available flight." Victoria felt tears threaten for the first time all evening. Thomas had thought to call her best friend, the one person who knew her before she became Mrs. Richard Hammond. The gesture was more thoughtful and caring than anything Rich had offered since this crisis began. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping Thomas's hand during the next contraction. Rich barely registered this information, still fielding calls about reputation management in the hallway outside her room. Through the glass door, Victoria could see him pacing and gesturing, his conversation animated and urgent. But she couldn't hear her own medical updates or their daughter's welfare mentioned in any of his phone discussions. The 3 a.m. Google searches. Victoria remembered all the nights she'd researched emotional affairs and financial infidelity and gaslighting in marriage, then deleted the browser history out of shame and confusion. The search terms had become a litany of doubt, signs your husband is planning to leave, and how to protect yourself financially, and postpartum depression versus intuition. She'd known, on some level, that their marriage was failing, but she'd been so conditioned to doubt her own perceptions that she'd sought validation from internet strangers rather than trusting her instincts. "The baby's heart rate is strong," Dr. Mitchell reported, checking the monitors with professional calm. "But we're seeing some irregularities in your blood pressure that concern me." Victoria focused on the doctor's steady voice. using it as an anchor against both the physical pain and the emotional turbulence. What kind of irregularities, elevated readings that suggest preeclampsia? It's manageable, but it explains some of the symptoms you've been experiencing. The fatigue, the visual disturbances, the sense of disconnection. Your body has been under significant stress. The medical validation felt like permission to acknowledge what Victoria had been minimizing for months. Her symptoms hadn't been normal pregnancy discomfort. They'd been her body's response to sustained emotional trauma. Dr. Mitchell continued her examination, her expression growing more serious. Victoria, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your home environment. Have you been feeling safe, supported? Are there stressors in your life that might be contributing to these complications? The questions opened a door Victoria hadn't known she could walk through. In the sterile honesty of the medical environment, she could finally admit truths she'd been hiding from herself. My husband is having an affair, Victoria said quietly. And I think he's been moving our money somewhere. I can't access it. Dr. Mitchell's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle examination. How long have you suspected this? Months? Maybe longer. I kept thinking I was being paranoid, that pregnancy hormones were making me oversensitive. But tonight you saw something that confirmed your instincts. Dr. Mitchell finished. Yes. The baby arrived at 2:47 a.m., healthy, beautiful, and bearing an undeniable resemblance to Victoria's late father around the eyes and nose. The moment Victoria held her daughter, everything else in the room fell away. This tiny person was hers completely, purely hers in a way that had nothing to do with performance or appearances or meeting other people's expectations. She's perfect, Victoria whispered, studying the baby's delicate features. Rich's first words upon seeing his daughter were not about her health or beauty or the miracle of her arrival. Good, he said, his voice carrying calculation rather than wonder. She looks like your side of the family. That should help with the custody arrangements. The casual cruelty of the comment hit Victoria like physical violence. Rich was already planning their divorce, already strategizing about how to minimize his financial obligations and maximize his access to their daughter when it suited his schedule. But his comment also revealed something he probably hadn't intended. He'd been thinking about custody arrangements for long enough to have developed preferences about their daughter's appearance. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of tonight's crisis. This was a plan that had been developing for months, in the quiet hours after Emma's birth, while Rich handled what he called necessary communications with his lawyer and business associates. Victoria experienced her first moments of pure love and clarity in longer than she could remember. No performance required, no fear of criticism, just the primal connection between mother and child. Thomas had fallen asleep in the bedside chair, his lanky frame folded awkwardly, but his presence comforting. Dr. Mitchell checked on them periodically, her professional care extending beyond medical necessity into something that felt like friendship. Near dawn, while Victoria was nursing Emma and Rich was absent handling another urgent call, Thomas stirred and noticed a purse left behind on the windowsill. That's not he observed, his voice still thick with sleep. Victoria looked where he was pointing. Elena's distinctive designer handbag sat forgotten on the ledge, apparently left behind during the confusion of the evening's medical emergency. Elena must have forgotten it, Victoria said, though something about the abandoned purse felt significant in a way she couldn't immediately identify. Thomas got up and moved toward the bag with the curiosity of a teenager who'd grown up watching detective shows. Should we call her or just leave it for Dad to return? But as Thomas picked up the purse, it fell open, spilling its contents across the hospital room floor. What scattered across the linoleum wasn't the usual collection of lipstick and credit cards that Victoria would have expected. Hotel room keys, multiple sets, from expensive hotels in the city and in locations Victoria recognized as Rich's recent business trip destinations, travel documents and boarding passes for flights Victoria hadn't known Elena had taken, and a manila folder marked Hammond Asset Distribution in Elena's neat handwriting. Thomas stared at the scattered papers, his 16-year-old mind quickly processing implications that would have taken Victoria much longer to piece together in her post-delivery exhaustion. Victoria, Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an adult understanding that made her chest tighten. I think you need to see this, and I think you need to call that lawyer your friend Grace recommended. Victoria shifted Emma to one arm, and accepted the folder Thomas handed her. Inside were financial documents that made her blood run cold despite the warm hospital room. Bank statements for accounts she'd never seen, property deeds for investments she'd never been told about, and a legal memo outlining strategies for asset protection in high-net-worth divorce proceedings. The documents were dated going back 18 months, exactly when Elena had first appeared in their lives as Rich's business consultant. This wasn't a recent affair that had spiraled out of control. This was a systematic, long-term plan to restructure Rich's financial life in preparation for ending their marriage. "Oh my God," Victoria whispered, her free hand trembling as she turned pages that detailed the methodical dismantling of the financial security she'd thought they were building together. Thomas moved closer, his young face serious with protective anger. "What is it?" "Evidence," Victoria replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Evidence that I'm not crazy, and I'm not paranoid, and I haven't been imagining things." The quiet strength that had been building since her water broke in front of 300 people crystallized into something harder and more determined. Victoria realized she wasn't just holding her newborn daughter. She was holding the future they would build together, free from the lies and manipulation that had defined the past 18 months. Rich returned as Victoria was carefully replacing the documents in Elena's folder. His phone finally silent for the first time since they'd arrived at the hospital. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, the possessive pronoun grating against Victoria's newly awakened awareness. "We're doing well," Victoria replied carefully. "Elena left her purse. Thomas found it." Rich's eyes flicked to the bag, then to Thomas, then back to Victoria. For just a moment, his careful composure slipped, revealing something calculating and concerned beneath his practiced charm. "I'll make sure she gets it back," Rich said, reaching for the purse. But Victoria held on to the folder, her grip firm despite her exhaustion. "Actually, I think I should return it personally. We need to talk anyway." Rich's expression sharpened. "About what?" Victoria looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then back at her husband. "About the future. About what kind of life we're going to build for our daughter." "Victoria," Rich said, his tone carrying a warning. "You're exhausted. This isn't the time for major conversations." But Victoria had spent 6 years deferring important conversations until more convenient times that never seemed to arrive. She'd postponed discussions about finances until Rich was less busy, delayed questions about their relationship until he was less stressed, put off addressing her concerns until moments that never materialized. "No," she said firmly. "This is exactly the time. While everything is honest and clear, and there's no room for pretending anymore." Thomas moved closer to Victoria's bedside, his teenage solidarity more valuable than any adult support she'd received in months. "Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, ostensibly checking on Emma's feeding schedule, but clearly sensing the tension in the room. Rich seemed to realize that his carefully managed crisis was sliding beyond his control. The evening that was supposed to establish his reputation as a generous family man had instead exposed the fundamental dishonesty of his most important relationships. But Victoria was no longer afraid of Rich's displeasure or concerned about managing his reputation. She was a mother now, responsible for protecting her daughter from the kind of emotional manipulation and financial deception that had nearly destroyed her own sense of reality. Elena's abandoned purse had provided more than just evidence of infidelity and financial fraud. It had given Victoria the proof she needed to trust her own perceptions, to believe her own instincts, and to stop apologizing for seeing clearly what others had been working so hard to hide. As dawn broke over the city, Victoria held her daughter and felt the last of her old life falling away. Whatever came next would be built on truth rather than performance, honesty rather than convenience, and love rather than control. Rich had made his choices over the past 18 months. Now it was Victoria's turn to choose the kind of future she wanted to build for herself and Emma. And that future, she was beginning to understand, looked very different from anything Rich and Elena had planned. Grace Williams arrived at the hospital at 7 in the morning, carrying coffee that smelled like salvation, and wearing the expression of a woman who'd been waiting 6 years for this phone call. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun that suggested she'd dressed quickly, but her brown eyes were sharp with the kind of alertness that came from genuine concern rather than social obligation. "I got here as fast as I could," Grace said, setting down the coffee and immediately moving to examine Emma with the practiced appreciation of a photographer who specialized in capturing authentic moments. She's beautiful, Tori. Absolutely perfect. The sound of her old nickname, unused since her marriage to Rich, made Victoria's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Grace had been her roommate at Northwestern, her maid of honor, her closest friend before Rich had gradually encouraged her to prioritize family obligations over external relationships. I've been waiting 6 years for you to realize what everyone else could see, Grace continued, settling into the bedside chair with the comfortable familiarity of their old friendship. Rich Hammond is a narcissist, and you deserve so much better than the way he's been treating you. The validation Victoria didn't know she needed flooded through her like warm water. Grace wasn't surprised by the evening's revelations. She wasn't shocked by Rich's affair or confused by his financial deceptions. She'd been watching and waiting and hoping that Victoria would eventually see clearly what had been obvious to her closest friend all along. You're not crazy, Grace said firmly. You're not difficult. You're married to someone who's been systematically undermining your confidence so you wouldn't trust your own perceptions. Victoria shifted Emma to one arm and reached for Grace's hand with the other. I found evidence. Financial documents. Elena's been helping him hide assets for over a year. Grace's expression hardened. Show me. Victoria handed over Elena's folder, watching Grace's face as she processed the bank statements and legal memos that documented Rich's careful preparation for their marriage's end. This is criminal, Grace said quietly. Financial fraud, asset concealment, possibly tax evasion, depending on how he structured these offshore accounts. How do you know about? I divorced a cheating husband 2 years ago, Grace replied with grim humor. I learned a lot about financial investigation during that process, and I know the best family law attorney in the state. Grace pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. James Morrison. He handled my divorce and specializes in high net worth cases involving asset concealment. He'll want to see these documents immediately. But before Grace could place the call, there was a knock on the hospital room door. A distinguished man in his 50s appeared, wearing an expensive suit that suggested legal rather than medical profession. Mrs. Hammond, I'm James Morrison. I represent your family's legal interests. Victoria's confusion must have shown on her face, because James Morrison's expression immediately softened. I apologize for the surprise visit, he said, but I've been documenting your husband's activities for some time, and I believe there are things you need to know urgently. Grace stood protectively beside Victoria's bed. Who sent you here? I sent myself, James replied. Mrs. Hammond, I've been the Hammond family attorney for 8 years. Officially, I represent both you and Richard. But ethically, I've become concerned about conflicts of interest that require disclosure. Victoria felt the world shifting again. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed clicking into place with devastating clarity. What kind of conflicts, she asked. James Morrison moved closer, his voice dropping to ensure privacy despite the hospital room's relative isolation. 18 months ago, your husband asked me to research asset protection strategies for high net worth individuals facing potential divorce proceedings. He specifically asked about offshore accounts, property transfers, and methods for minimizing spousal support obligations. The timeline matched perfectly with Elena's arrival in their lives. Victoria felt her newborn daughter stir in her arms, as if sensing the tension radiating from her mother. I advised him that I couldn't ethically provide such services while also representing you as his spouse, James continued. He said he understood and would seek separate counsel for those matters. But I've been watching, and I've been documenting. Grace leaned forward. Documenting what? Everything, James replied. Bank transfers, property purchases, business formations. Your husband has been systematically moving marital assets into accounts and entities that would be difficult to trace or recover in divorce proceedings. Victoria realized she'd been living in a house equivalent of checking her phone obsessively, constantly adjusting her behavior to avoid Rich's displeasure. Never realizing the problem wasn't her behavior, but his fundamental dishonesty about their relationship. How much money are we talking about? Victoria asked. James consulted a folder he'd brought with him. Approximately $4.2 million in various offshore accounts. 2 properties in the Cayman Islands purchased through shell corporations, and a business partnership with Ms. Elena Cartwright that appears designed to legitimize ongoing financial transfers. The numbers were staggering. Victoria had been worried about affording Emma's college education, while Rich had been hiding enough money to fund several lifetimes of financial security. "There's more," James said gently. "Ms. Cartwright isn't just your husband's business partner. She's also his intended business successor. The documents I've reviewed suggest plans for her to gradually assume control of his real estate holdings while he transitions to what the paperwork euphemistically calls international consulting." Grace's photographer's instincts kicked in. "You mean they're planning to disappear together?" "Not disappear," James corrected. "Relocate. There are property records showing purchases in several countries that don't have extradition treaties with the United States for financial crimes." Victoria felt Emma shift in her arms and looked down at her daughter's peaceful face. This tiny person deserved better than to grow up as collateral damage in her father's elaborate schemes for abandoning his responsibilities. "What can we do?" Victoria asked. "Legally, quite a lot," James replied. "The documentation of asset concealment provides grounds for fraud charges. The offshore accounts violate several federal banking regulations, and the business partnership with Miss Cartwright appears to involve some creative tax avoidance that the IRS would find very interesting." Thomas appeared in the doorway, having returned from the hospital cafeteria with breakfast sandwiches that smelled like processed cheese and hope. "Am I interrupting something important?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already understood the gravity of the conversation. "Thomas," Victoria said, "I want you to hear this. It affects your future too." James Morrison looked uncertain about including a minor in discussions of financial fraud and marital dissolution, but Victoria's tone left no room for argument. "Your father has been planning to leave your stepmother for over a year," she said directly, "and he's been stealing money from both of you to fund his new life with Elena." Thomas's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, and finally a grim satisfaction that suggested he'd suspected something like this for longer than he'd been willing to admit. "I knew Dad was up to something," Thomas said, "but I didn't think he was actually stealing from you." "It's not just theft," Grace interjected. "It's systematic financial abuse designed to leave Victoria powerless and financially dependent." Margaret Hammond's arrival interrupted their strategy session, her presence filling the hospital room like an expensive perfume that couldn't quite mask underlying decay. Rich's mother swept in wearing Chanel and carrying flowers that looked like they'd been selected more for their impressive appearance than any consideration of Victoria's preferences. "Victoria, dear," Margaret said with practiced sympathy, "I hope you understand that divorce would be very difficult for someone in your position. No family money, no career, and now a baby to consider." The casual cruelty was delivered with Margaret's characteristic precision, designed to remind Victoria of her perceived vulnerabilities while maintaining the appearance of grandmotherly concern. But Thomas stepped forward with surprising steel in his young voice. "Actually, grandmother, Victoria has more family than she knows, and she's stronger than any of you realize." The loyalty from her stepson hit Victoria like an unexpected gift. Thomas had chosen sides in a conflict that was just beginning to surface publicly, and his choice revealed a depth of character that made her proud to be part of his life, even if that connection had to be redefined. Grace moved closer to Margaret, her photographer's eye capturing details that others might miss. "Mrs. Hammond," Grace said politely, "I think you might be surprised by how much support Victoria actually has, and how much evidence she's gathered about your son's activities." Margaret's expression sharpened with the predatory intelligence that had made her a force in society circles for 4 decades. "What kind of evidence?" she asked. Victoria realized that Margaret's surprise visit wasn't motivated by grandmotherly concern for Emma or sympathy for Victoria's situation. Rich's mother was conducting reconnaissance, trying to understand how much Victoria knew and how significant a threat she might pose to the family's carefully maintained reputation. "The kind that makes for very interesting reading," Victoria replied calmly, "especially for federal investigators who specialize in financial crimes." Margaret's composure flickered for just a moment, revealing genuine concern beneath her polished exterior. "Victoria," Margaret said carefully, "I hope you'll consider the implications of any hasty decisions. Legal proceedings can be so damaging to everyone involved, especially children." But Victoria was no longer intimidated by Margaret's veiled threats or impressed by her social connections. She was a mother now, responsible for protecting her daughter from the kind of manipulation and emotional abuse that had characterized her own experience with the Hammond family. "I'm considering all the implications," Victoria replied, "especially the implications for Emma if I allow her to grow up thinking this kind of behavior is normal or acceptable." Dr. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, ostensibly returning with paperwork that required Rich's signature for Emma's birth certificate. But her timing suggested she'd been monitoring the situation and sensed that Victoria might need medical support for whatever family drama was unfolding. "Mr. Hammond is in deep conversation with Ms. Cartwright about damage control in the family conference room," Dr. Mitchell observed neutrally. "Should I wait for him to finish his discussion, or would you prefer to handle the paperwork now?" Victoria felt the pieces of her new life clicking into place with satisfying precision. Rich was so focused on managing his reputation and protecting his assets that he wasn't paying attention to the legal documents that would establish his relationship to Emma. "I'd like to handle it now," Victoria said, "while everything is clear and properly documented." As Dr. Mitchell spread the birth certificate paperwork across the bedside table, Victoria realized she held more power in this moment than she'd possessed at any point in her 6-year marriage. Rich trusted her to handle routine paperwork while he managed what he considered more important crises. But paperwork, Victoria was learning, could be the foundation for rebuilding a life that had been systematically undermined, with her daughter sleeping peacefully in one arm and her chosen family gathered around her. Victoria began to understand that the quiet strength she'd been developing over the past few hours was about to become the foundation for everything that came next. Rich and Elena had made their plans without considering that Victoria might develop plans of her own. They were about to discover that the woman they'd dismissed as a convenient victim had resources, allies, and determination they'd never bothered to assess. The battle for Emma's future and Victoria's freedom was just beginning. But for the first time in months, Victoria felt confident about her chances of winning. Victoria's hospital room had transformed into something resembling a war room by late morning. Grace had set up her laptop on the bedside table. James Morrison had spread legal documents across every available surface, and Thomas acted as lookout for Rich's return from his extended damage control session with Elena. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows illuminated papers that detailed 18 months of systematic financial deception. But Victoria felt clearer and more focused than she had in years. Emma slept peacefully in her arms, occasionally stirring as if sensing the importance of the activities surrounding her arrival in the world. "The key thing to understand," James was explaining, "is that your husband has been planning this exit strategy since before your pregnancy. The timing of these financial transfers suggests he intended to be free of marital obligations before the baby arrived." Grace looked up from her laptop screen. "But Emma's birth actually strengthens Victoria's position. Doesn't it? Child support, custody considerations, the optics of abandoning a newborn." "Significantly," James confirmed, "especially given the documentation we now have of premeditated asset concealment. Family court judges don't look favorably on fathers who hide money while their wives are pregnant." Victoria found herself marveling at how efficiently her impromptu team was operating. Grace's photography business had taught her to capture evidence and organize complex visual narratives. James's legal expertise provided the framework for understanding Rich's strategies and developing countermeasures. And Thomas, despite his youth, understood his father's psychology in ways that proved invaluable for predicting next moves. "The strategic planning phase is almost complete," Victoria observed, adjusting Emma's position as her daughter began to wake. "While Rich believes I'm in vulnerable new mother mode, I'm actually gathering evidence and preparing for battle." Thomas moved to the window, monitoring the hallway for signs of his father's return. "He's been recording his phone calls," Thomas said quietly. "Dad, I've been using my phone to capture his conversations about asset protection and timeline acceleration." The revelation that Thomas had been conducting his own surveillance operation surprised everyone in the room. Grace grinned with approval, while James looked professionally impressed by the teenager's initiative. "How long have you been doing this?" Victoria asked. "Since I figured out what was really going on," Thomas replied. "Maybe 3 months. Dad thinks I'm just playing games on my phone, but I've been documenting everything I could." The evidence Thomas had gathered included recorded conversations between Rich and Elena about finalizing the Cayman transfers and accelerating the timeline for their planned relocation. The audio quality was surprisingly clear, and the content was devastating for any future legal proceedings. Victoria did what she always did when overwhelmed. She organized, but instead of kitchen drawers or closet shelves, she was organizing evidence, bank statements, and witness testimonials that would protect her daughter's future and secure her own independence. "We need to prioritize," Victoria said, her voice carrying an authority she hadn't known she possessed. "What are the most time-sensitive elements?" James consulted his notes. "The offshore transfers are ongoing. Every day we delay action, more assets disappear into accounts that will be difficult to recover. I recommend filing emergency injunctions to freeze all marital assets while we prepare the comprehensive case." Grace nodded. "And we need to document Elena's role in this. The business partnership might give us leverage if she's concerned about criminal exposure." Before they could continue their planning, Elena appeared in the doorway with her characteristic confidence, apparently arriving to check on the baby, but clearly conducting her own reconnaissance mission. But instead of finding Victoria alone and vulnerable, Elena discovered her surrounded by allies, fully dressed despite having given birth less than 12 hours earlier, and holding both her daughter and a folder full of incriminating evidence. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely from what Elena had expected to find. "Victoria," Elena said, her smile slightly less certain than usual, "I hope you understand that Rich and I never intended for things to get so complicated." Victoria looked at Elena with newfound clarity, seeing her not as the sophisticated businesswoman she'd pretended to be, but as someone who had systematically undermined another woman's marriage and financial security for personal gain. "I understand perfectly," Victoria replied calmly. "You intended to steal my husband, my money, and my security. What you didn't intend was for me to fight back." Elena's composure flickered as she realized that Victoria was no longer the confused, self-doubting woman she'd been manipulating for months. "I think there might be some misunderstanding," Elena began. "No misunderstanding," Victoria interrupted. "I have your financial documents. I have recorded conversations. I have bank statements showing systematic asset concealment. The only misunderstanding was mine, thinking you were just a business associate instead of recognizing you as a co-conspirator in financial fraud." Separate form, Grace stood from her laptop, her photographer's instincts capturing the shift in Elena's body language as the other woman realized how completely her position had been compromised. "The hotel's security footage from last night's gala has been legally obtained," Grace added conversationally. "It shows Rich deliberately tearing Victoria's dress. Assault charges are certainly possible, especially given her pregnant condition at the time." Elena's face went pale as she processed the implications of criminal charges in addition to civil litigation. Her carefully planned future with Rich would be significantly complicated by federal investigations and potential prison sentences. James Morrison stepped forward with the measured authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes legal negotiations. "Ms. Cartwright, I should inform you that your business partnership with Mr. Hammond appears to violate several federal banking regulations regarding asset concealment and tax avoidance. The penalties for such violations can include both criminal prosecution and civil forfeiture of all related assets." Victoria watched Elena's calculations shift in real time as she realized that her association with Rich had made her vulnerable to consequences she hadn't anticipated. The sophisticated businesswoman who had been so confident about displacing Victoria was now facing the possibility of losing everything she'd gained from her relationship with Rich. "Victoria," Elena said carefully, "perhaps we could discuss this privately. Woman to woman." "I don't think so," Victoria replied. "I'm done with private conversations that aren't witnessed and documented. Everything from now on happens with my legal representation present." The birth certificate's surprise Victoria had been planning came together perfectly as Dr. Mitchell returned with the paperwork Rich needed to sign to establish his legal relationship to Emma. "Mr. Hammond is still in conference with his business associates," Dr. Mitchell reported neutrally. "Should I wait for his availability, or would you prefer to complete the documentation now?" Victoria looked at the birth certificate forms, then at Elena, then back at Dr. Mitchell. "I'd like to make one small addition to the emergency contact information," Victoria said, "for completeness." As Dr. Mitchell prepared the paperwork, Victoria quietly added Elena Cartwright's name and phone number to the emergency contact section, listing her as father's business partner, immediate family notification. The addition seemed innocuous, but it created a legal document that connected Elena to Emma's birth and established a paper trail for the relationship between Elena and Rich that could be subpoenaed in future proceedings. "This is ready for your husband's signature," Dr. Mitchell said, preparing to leave the forms for Rich's return. But Victoria realized she had one more strategic move available. "Actually," Victoria said, "I'd like to add one more emergency contact, Thomas Hammond, as Emma's half-brother." The addition was perfectly reasonable from a family perspective, but it also established Thomas's legal standing as a family member with interests that might be affected by his father's financial decisions. Thomas understood immediately what Victoria was accomplishing. "I'll make sure Dad signs everything properly," he said with 17-year-old determination. Elena seemed to realize that she was witnessing the construction of a legal framework that would make her relationship with Rich exponentially more complicated and potentially costly. "I should go," Elena said abruptly. "Rich is expecting me to handle some urgent business matters." But as she moved toward the door, Victoria's voice stopped her. "Elena," Victoria said quietly, "you forgot your purse yesterday. I believe you'll find everything exactly as you left it." The threat was delivered with polite courtesy, but Elena understood that Victoria was now in possession of documents that could destroy both her business relationship with Rich and her personal freedom. "Thank you," Elena managed, accepting the purse with hands that trembled slightly. As Elena left the hospital room, Victoria felt the transformed power she'd been building all morning crystallize into something harder and more determined. She didn't need to destroy Rich and Elena to protect herself and Emma. She just needed to stop enabling them to destroy her. Rich returned 20 minutes later to find his carefully constructed crisis completely beyond his control. The woman he'd dismissed as emotionally fragile and financially dependent had assembled a legal team, gathered evidence of his criminal activity, and positioned herself as the injured party in what would inevitably become a very public and very expensive legal battle. "Victoria," Rich said carefully, noting the change in atmosphere immediately, "we need to talk." "Yes," Victoria agreed, settling Emma more comfortably in her arms. "We do. But this time, we're going to have that conversation with witnesses and legal representation. I'm done with private discussions that I'm expected to forget or reinterpret later." Rich's expression shifted through several emotions as he realized that his wife had fundamentally changed during the few hours he'd spent managing his reputation and protecting his assets. The woman looking back at him was no longer afraid of his anger, no longer willing to prioritize his comfort over her own needs, and no longer interested in preserving a marriage that had been built on systematic deception. Victoria realized she didn't need to win against Rich in the traditional sense. She just needed to stop losing by refusing to play by rules that had been designed to ensure her defeat. The real battle was just beginning, but Victoria finally understood that she'd been fighting with her hands tied behind her back for 6 years. Now that she was free to use all her resources, legal, financial, and emotional, the outcome was no longer predetermined. Rich and Elena had made their plans without considering that Victoria might develop agency of her own. They were about to discover that the woman they'd underestimated was perfectly capable of protecting herself and her daughter, and she was just getting started. 6 months after Emma's dramatic entrance into the world, Victoria stood in the same ballroom where her old life had ended, wearing a dress of her own choosing and carrying her daughter with the confidence of a woman who had learned to trust her own judgment. The Winterfield Children's Hospital was dedicating their new pediatric wing, now officially renamed the Emma Hammond Memorial Wing, in honor of Victoria's separate donation funding that had come from her share of the recovered marital assets that Rich had attempted to hide. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that Rich's efforts to conceal their money had ultimately provided her with the resources needed to build an independent life for herself and Emma. The offshore accounts he'd established to fund his new life with Elena had been frozen by federal investigators, their contents redistributed according to court orders that established Victoria's rightful claim to marital property. "Mrs. Hammond," Dr. Patterson approached with genuine warmth. "Thank you again for your generosity. The new wing will transform our ability to serve young patients and their families." Victoria smiled, adjusting Emma's position in her arms. Her daughter had grown into a beautiful, alert 6-month-old who seemed to find hospital environments as comfortable as home, perhaps because they'd spent so much time there during the legal proceedings that had restructured their lives. "It's important that families can stay together during medical crises," Victoria replied, echoing Rich's words from that night 6 months ago. But when she spoke them, they carried the weight of lived experience rather than empty rhetoric. Thomas appeared at her side, now 17 and somehow both taller and more mature than when this journey had begun. The legal proceedings had emancipated him from his father's custody, allowing him to choose where he wanted to live during his final year of high school. "Grace is here," Thomas reported, scanning the crowd for Victoria's best friend, who had become not just emotional support, but business partner in Victoria's new venture. "She's setting up the camera equipment for the dedication ceremony." Victoria's new life had unexpected dimensions she couldn't have imagined during those dark months of her marriage. Grace's photography business had expanded to include legal documentation and evidence gathering, services that had proved surprisingly in demand among women navigating high-conflict divorces. Victoria's experience with financial investigation had led to consulting work helping other women identify hidden assets and protect themselves from economic abuse. Together, they'd created something powerful, a support network for women who'd been systematically undermined by partners who confused control with love. "Any word from Dad?" Thomas asked, though his tone suggested the question was asked from obligation rather than hope. "His lawyer sent the usual settlement demands," Victoria replied, "but his negotiating position gets weaker every month as more evidence surfaces." Rich's legal troubles had multiplied beyond the initial charges of asset concealment and financial fraud. Elena's cooperation with federal investigators had revealed a network of tax avoidance schemes and regulatory violations that had attracted attention from multiple agencies. His real estate empire was being systematically dismantled to pay fines and settlements that grew larger with each new investigation. Elena herself had accepted a plea agreement that required her to testify against Rich in exchange for reduced charges. The sophisticated businesswoman, who had been so confident about stealing another woman's life, was now working as a paralegal in a small firm while completing court-ordered community service. The unexpected alliance between Victoria and Elena had proved strategically valuable. Though it remained personally complicated, Elena's inside knowledge of Rich's business practices had been crucial for identifying hidden assets and documenting fraudulent transfers. But Victoria found it difficult to maintain anything approaching friendship with someone who had systematically worked to destroy her marriage. "Forgiveness is overrated," Grace had observed during one of their strategy sessions. "You don't have to like her to use her information effectively." Margaret Hammond made her way across the ballroom with the measured dignity of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered, but who refused to acknowledge the change publicly. Rich's mother had been forced to sell the family estate to cover legal fees and judgments, but she maintained her social calendar as if her reduced circumstances were a temporary inconvenience, rather than the consequences of her son's criminal behavior. "Victoria, dear," Margaret said, her tone carrying grudging respect that hadn't been present 6 months earlier. "Emma's looking well. Motherhood suits you." The comment was as close to an apology as Margaret was capable of offering. Victoria had learned to accept these small acknowledgments without expecting more substantial recognition of the harm that had been done. "Thank you, Margaret," Victoria replied diplomatically. "I hope you're adjusting well to your new living arrangements." Margaret's jaw tightened slightly at the reminder of her changed circumstances, but she maintained her composure. "Change can be enlightening. I've discovered resources I didn't know I possessed." Dr. Mitchell joined their small group, her presence providing comfortable professional authority in what could have been an awkward social situation. "The dedication ceremony is about to begin," Dr. Mitchell announced. "Victoria, would you like to say a few words about the Wing's mission?" Victoria looked around the ballroom that had once represented the pinnacle of her social anxiety and performance pressure. The same crystal chandeliers cast light over many of the same faces that had witnessed her humiliation 6 months ago. But everything else had fundamentally changed. She was no longer Mrs. Richard Hammond, perfect accessory to her husband's ambitions. She was Victoria Hammond, successful consultant, single mother, and survivor of systematic financial abuse who had rebuilt her life on foundations of honesty rather than appearance. "I'd be honored," Victoria replied. As she approached the small stage where Rich had once delivered his speech about family values and charitable giving, Victoria felt the weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. Emma settled comfortably in her arms, apparently unbothered by the attention and applause of the assembled crowd. 6 months ago, Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom, I learned that some of life's most devastating moments can also be its most liberating. Emma's birth taught me that strength often emerges from situations that initially feel like complete disasters. She paused, noting familiar faces in the crowd, some supportive, some curious, some uncomfortable with the direct reference to events that had been the subject of considerable gossip over the past months. The Emma Hammond Memorial Wing represents more than just medical excellence, Victoria continued. It represents the idea that families deserve honesty, children deserve protection, and women deserve support during their most vulnerable moments. The applause was warm and sustained, but Victoria noticed that several people in the crowd were checking their phones or examining their programs rather than meeting her eyes. The social dynamics that had once intimidated her now seemed manageable and sometimes amusing. She no longer needed their approval or feared their judgment. The opinions of people who had watched her husband systematically undermine her well-being without offering support or intervention weren't particularly relevant to her current priorities. After the ceremony, Victoria found herself in conversation with several women who approached her with questions that had nothing to do with charitable donations or medical facilities. I've heard you're helping women with financial investigations, said a woman whose husband Victoria recognized as one of Rich's former business associates. Could we perhaps have coffee sometime? The request was delivered with the careful casualness of someone who couldn't afford to appear desperate but clearly needed help. Victoria had received dozens of similar inquiries over the past months, often from women who had been watching their own marriages with growing unease. Of course, Victoria replied, offering her business card. Grace and I have office hours on Wednesdays specifically for initial consultations. Thomas appeared with Emma's diaper bag in the practical efficiency of someone who had become an expert at managing infant care logistics. Ready to go home? He asked. Emma's getting fussy, and you have that conference call with the investigators at 8. Home was a renovated brownstone that Victoria had purchased with her portion of the recovered assets. The space was smaller than the mansion she'd shared with Rich, but it felt infinitely larger because every room belonged completely to her and Emma. The evening routine had become one of Victoria's favorite parts of each day. She would give Emma her bath while Thomas worked on homework at the kitchen table. Then they would read together while Emma had her final feeding before bed. The domesticity was simple and honest in ways that her previous life's elaborate performances had never achieved. Any regrets? Grace asked during one of their weekly dinners together. The question had become a ritual between them, a way of checking that Victoria's new life remained aligned with her authentic priorities. Victoria looked around her living room, noting Thomas bent over calculus homework, Emma sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, and Grace editing photos on her laptop. The scene was quieter and less glamorous than the social events that had once filled her calendar, but it felt profoundly more real. No regrets, Victoria replied honestly. Not about leaving, not about fighting, not about building something different. The phone rang, displaying the number of James Morrison's legal office. Victoria answered with the comfort of someone who no longer feared unexpected calls from lawyers. Victoria, James said, I have an update on Rich's plea negotiations. His legal team is requesting another settlement conference next week. What are they offering now? Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew. Rich's negotiating position had deteriorated steadily as more evidence of financial crime surfaced. Full restitution of concealed assets, supervised visitation with Emma, and agreement to the custody arrangements you proposed. In exchange, he wants you to not oppose his request for minimum security federal prison placement. Victoria considered the offer while watching her daughter sleep. Rich would spend the next few years in federal custody, regardless of her cooperation. But his comfort during that incarceration wasn't really her responsibility. I'll think about it, Victoria said. But I'm not interested in making his consequences easier just because he's finally ready to acknowledge reality. After ending the call, Victoria returned to the peaceful evening routine that had become the foundation of her new life. Thomas helped clean up after dinner, while she prepared Emma's bottles for the next day. The tasks were mundane but satisfying in their complete absence of performance anxiety or fear of criticism. At 9 o'clock, After Emma was settled for the night and Thomas had disappeared to his room for teenage privacy, Victoria sat in her reading chair with a cup of tea and the business plan she was developing for expanding her consulting services. The irony wasn't lost on her that Rich's systematic efforts to destroy her financial independence had inadvertently provided her with expertise that was now in considerable demand. Her experience identifying hidden assets and documenting financial abuse had created opportunities she never could have imagined during her years as a conventional society wife. Her phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw your interview in Business Week. Would like to discuss consulting services for friend situation? Confidential matter. Available for meeting next week. Victoria smiled as she typed her response. Scheduling yet another consultation with someone who needed help understanding the difference between love and control, between partnership and manipulation. As she prepared for bed, Victoria checked on Emma one final time. Her daughter slept with the complete peace of someone who had never known anything but safety and honesty and unconditional love. Victoria realized that she had not only survived Rich's betrayal and Elena's schemes, she had used their cruelty as the foundation for building something better than anything she could have achieved by staying in her beautiful, suffocating marriage. The woman who had once checked her phone obsessively now answered when she wanted to and ignored calls that didn't serve her priorities. The freedom to choose her own responses had become her greatest luxury. Standing in Emma's nursery, Victoria remembered the closing line from that devastating night 6 months ago. Some cages were made of gold, others of lies. But the most beautiful freedom came from realizing you had always held the key. She'd finally learned to use it, and the door she'd opened led to a life that was entirely her own creation. Smaller perhaps than what she'd had before, but infinitely more real, more honest, and more sustainable than anything built on someone else's version of who she should be. Victoria turned off the nursery light and walked toward her own bedroom, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. She was no longer afraid of uncertainty, no longer intimidated by the prospect of building a life without someone else's script to follow. Emma would grow up watching her mother make choices based on authentic values rather than external expectations. And that, Victoria realized, was worth more than all the golden cages and elaborate performances that money could buy. The story that had begun with public humiliation and private betrayal had evolved into something neither Rich nor Elena could have anticipated: complete transformation of the woman they dismissed as expendable. Victoria Hammond had discovered that the most powerful revenge was refusing to remain a victim, and the most satisfying justice was building a life so authentic and fulfilling that her previous existence seemed like a performance she'd been hired to give for someone else's benefit. She was finally, completely, herself. And that person was stronger, wiser, and more capable than anyone, including Victoria herself, had ever imagined possible. The future stretched ahead with unlimited possibility, and Victoria was ready to meet it on her own terms. Victoria's journey from that humiliating night to building her own empire is proof that sometimes our worst moments become our greatest opportunities. She learned that strength isn't about never falling down, it's about who you choose to become when you get back up. If Victoria's story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you were performing in someone else's version of your life, or if you know someone who needs to hear that they're stronger than they think, hit that like button. Your engagement helps stories like Victoria's reach women who might need to hear them most. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a moment that felt like complete disaster but turned out to be exactly what you needed? I read every single comment, and your stories often inspire the next episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because every week we're sharing real stories about real women who refuse to stay victims of other people's choices. These aren't just entertainment, they're roadmaps for anyone ready to reclaim their own life. And if you think someone in your life needs to hear Victoria's story, share this episode. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone, we're not crazy, and we're definitely not powerless. Next week, we're diving into Sarah's story, a woman who discovered her husband's secret family the same day she got her dream job promotion. You won't believe how she turned the tables on everyone who underestimated her. Until then, remember you've always held the key to your own cage. The question is, are you ready to use it? I'll see you next time.